And we've got great natural areas too. And maybe bobcats. Somebody needs to come look. Emilio.
All right, so we're good. We're on YouTube. We're going to YouTube now. All right, everyone. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are throughout the world. This is another fine seminar series. Today, I'm your host. My name is Lauren Hayes. I'm a professor at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and I'm really happy today to be hosting a panel discussion on the evolution of a research program. Before I do that, I want to thank our speaker from last week, Ali Harari from Israel, who spoke to us about it was sex differences in fishes, I believe. And next week, I'm going to share my screen here in just a moment. If I can find the file. Next week, our speaker is going to be David Fisher, and I'm just about to find it. So David Fisher will be from the Aberdeen University in the United Kingdom. Will be talking to us about social interactions and how they may influence or how they're altered by evolution. And so David's a regular at the Find, so we're excited to see him give a talk next week. Okay, so if you're interested, please attend. It will be, I think next week we'll be back on the regular time for not the regular, the U.S. changes its clock soon, so I think next week we'll be back on 11 o'clock U.S., 5 o'clock in Paris. All right, so today the Find today is focusing on the evolution of a research program, and just want to give a little bit of background on this before I introduce the panel. Um, the idea for this came from years of discussion, both when I was a student and then also as a faculty member. And it actually initiated at the American Society of Mammalogists meeting in 1999 when I was a master's student. I went to what was called Breakfast for a Scientist. It was the conference. At the conference, the ASM would have special meetings with professors meeting with students, and I was a master's student at the time. And I met with Kevin, it was Swihart, who was a small mammal biologist in the United States. And he asked us the question, what's the difference between a project and a program? And the discussion that ensued was really insightful to me and really impactful, obviously. Made me think about, how do what goes into a project? And then ultimately, as you build up in a career, what goes into a program, a research program? And really the big question for me, over the years is how do you get from the project to a program? And it was that meeting that started that thought process in my head. And as I said, of course, over the years, through discussions with various advisors and colleagues, I formulated an idea of what I was trying to do more broadly, which is now my research program. And so I just want to quickly kind of show you this. So the goal of the panel, by the way, is to bring attention to the distinction between a research project and program. And I will admit this is a very U.S. focused discussion. All the panelists are from the United States, and so it's going to be really interesting to see how that unique perspective could differ from other perspectives based on funding agencies, differences in approach. And I think it's important that everyone understands how different countries do things in the event people want to move between locations. Hopefully, the discussion will also get into how to make that transition. What kinds of things does one have to do to grow a project into something bigger that involves students and postdocs, etc. Um, and I think those are the two main goals. I mean, I think it's important. Hopefully, it'll be a good discussion that will be useful to a lot of people um, as they progress through their career. And so, I just want to start by showing you a slide of mine. And basically, this is just to give you a sense of kind of what my trajectory has been, and then I'll introduce the panelists, and you'll see that the trajectory is all very different, and we're at different stages. So for me, I was, as an undergraduate, I was an undergraduate at a small college in Maine. And there I was, exposed to more marine biological approaches. And can everyone see the slide that I'm showing here? Okay. Um, so, I was exposed to, marine biology. So I studied variation in the electric organ discharge of marine skates. There's weakly electric fish. And that just got me into science. It got me into the process of science, and then was also a springboard to my master's work, which was at Michigan State, where I studied house mouse habitat use in agricultural landscapes. And quite honestly, that project bombed. So I learned how to do things wrong, I guess. And then I also wrote a review article at that time, something I talked to my students about as a really excellent process. I wrote a review article on communal nesting and nursing that really helped me develop projects for my dissertation, where my project there with one of the panelists today, Nancy Solomon, was looking at maternal investment in communal prairie voles. And for that, I openly admit right up front, I milked voles. So you're in the room with someone who's actually milked a rodent. And that project had four main themes to it, but still, as a dissertation, it wasn't a full-blown program because I really didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. But eventually, particularly in my early career, I shifted to working with the Degu, which I've talked about in the Fine, social rodent in Chile. And I was interested from at that time, questions about ecological causes and fitness consequences of group living in that species and other plural breeders, and delved into some of the physiological mechanisms underlying social variation in Degus. And at that point, as I furthered my career, where now I believe I'm sort of late-ish career, depending how things go in the next 5, I started asking more layered questions like, how does climatic variation shape the fitness consequences of group living in Degus? And in collaboration with Carsten Schroden, got into a more comparative study where interested in intraspecific variation in mammalian social organization and mating systems. And so it's gone through the trajectory of my career. It's gone from a single study on skates to single studies on mice to a series of studies on prairie voles that informed and generated my understanding and interest in bigger questions that then became this long-term study on degus and a comparative study on mammals. Hopefully, my goal is to use that to answer central questions about animal social systems. And so with that, that's just to kind of give you a sense of what my view of this is. The panelists are going to share where they are. And so I want to just start by basically turning it over to them. And so I'm going to introduce the panelists first, and I'm going to have the panelists then share some of where they are in that, similar to that I just did in their career, in their trajectory. And then the structure of the panel initially, it'll be open-ended, but there will be some back and forth, hopefully, where, I think it's a great idea to have the students ask questions of the different panel, the professors. We have two. The two professors we have here today are Nancy Solomon, from Miami University. Nancy Solomon was my PhD advisor and has been, really important voice in studying communal care and in particularly using the prairie vole as the primary model. So big into research on cooperation and communal living. Then Kathleen Carroll, who was, and you're going to see this as a family affair. Kathleen Carroll was a master's student in my lab in 2013-ish. And she is now an assistant professor at the University of Rhode Island. And Kathleen's research intersects conservation and behavior. I'll let her tell you more about that. And then there's the part of the panelists are the students. And I have 3 students who are currently working on a project in Chile with the Degus. We have a PhD candidate from Virginia Tech, that's Xavier Ozawara. And we have Emilio Pedrosa Lopez, that's a master's student. He's going to be going to the University of Rhode Island to work with Kathleen. And last but not least is Autumn Sims. She will be doing a master's project down at Tennessee Tech, which is about 2 hours from where I live, and I'll be serving on her committee. She'll be working with Degus. And so it's an opportunity for the students to ask the faculty questions, for the faculty to ask students questions, and hopefully what we can get out of this, whatever we get out is great, but hopefully we can get some kind of understanding of what it takes to develop a sustainable research program. And then after the discussion, after about 30, 40 minutes, then we'll open up questions for everyone here as well as in YouTube. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the panelists. I've talked long enough. And so why don't we start with, we'll start with Nancy first. Nancy Solomon. And Nancy, do you want me to share screen with your slide?
That's fine.
Okay. So I'm going to share Nancy.
Yeah.
I'm going to share Nancy's slide here in just a moment. And why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and we'll get going.
Okay. Thank you, Lauren. And as you could tell, well, anyways, when I was an undergrad, I knew I was interested in biology, and I didn't really know what biologists did. So I was sent off to the offices and lab of the new faculty member on campus who didn't have any grad students. And he took me to the field station for a summer. Without that experience, I wouldn't have been doing this. So there I didn't really work with him. But I was interested in the small mammals. I knew I was interested in behavior. I had no idea what. We had a little library there at the field station, 2 hours from anywhere. And so I was the only small mammal we had that I knew about at the time was eastern chipmunks, because the director of the station was doing a population level project with them. So eastern chipmunks it was. And I live trapping and taking them back to campus to work on them during that next school year, my senior year. And it seemed like there was a gap in the literature on aggression, interspecific aggression in eastern chipmunks. And so I conducted a lab study, dyadic encounters, looking at measures of aggression. So I came up with an ethogram describing the different specific behaviors that could be considered aggression. I wasn't sophisticated enough to know how to rank them in terms of intensity or anything else at that point. But anyways, I conducted what Pitt considered an honors thesis on aggression in eastern chipmunks. So I sort of enjoyed doing that project, but I didn't really think that was the behavior that was the most interesting to me. Now, eastern chipmunks are solitary, so for that species, this was a good question, but I was more interested in social behavior, intraspecific social behaviors. I was back in Cleveland where I grew up due to some family issues and working on a master's place bound. There was nobody doing behavior in the biology department. So I found somebody in the psychology department, an experimental psychologist who studied learning, and talked him into letting me do something behavioral. So in that department, usually the choices for the experimental psychologists were rats or college students. I chose I tried to get something going at the zoo, but the sample size was a major problem. So I decided rats it would be, because that's what he used there, and had read about cooperative breeding and communal care by then. This was in the early 80s. So rats seemed like the lab rats seemed like they would lend themselves to that. I could look at, like Lauren was referring to, sort of plural breeding, when you have multiple females together, and what went on in terms of communal care. Nobody really told me I should be testing a hypothesis with the main part. of my thesis. So the main part was pretty descriptive, and then I had some side projects looking at discrimination of own versus others young. So I went from an interest in behavior to an interest in social behavior. I narrowed it down a little, but it wasn't a very satisfying project to me because I didn't consider these rats real animals. They were highly inbred lab rats. So when I went on to conduct my PhD, I wanted a real animal. Um, and the person I was working with had a long-term study going on population demography with a little bit of behavior in prairie voles at University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. So I can't remember why anymore. I didn't want to study communal care anymore, but it ended up being more similar to that than I had initially thought. And so I was looking at the juveniles in this case who remained at their nest, and this was a lab setup, so they were in the cage with the parents, and what benefits they accrued from helping care for their younger siblings, essentially. And then went on and had three more projects that stemmed from the one in the indirect fitness benefits. So it wasn't necessarily at this point other questions on cooperative breeding. It was fitness benefits and things related to that. But I knew I was interested in cooperative breeding at that point, and the prairie vole was a good model. Nobody was studying them as a model of cooperative breeding at that point, but I had an opportunity to study a related species for a postdoc, and that line's missing. You have to click again, Lauren. I don't know how this, yeah, there we go. I don't know how this happened. So even fewer people were looking at pine voles. There was one woman in New York State who had studied them some. So I got to study pine voles in the lab at North Carolina State University and in an apple orchard where they were free roaming and, according to the apple grower, incredible pests, chewing on the roots of the trees and all this. But he didn't kill them. So it was a great study place. Um, so I was looking at this point in another aspect of cooperative breeding, and that was what affected whether or not individuals moved when they left their natal nest, natal burrow, what affected where they moved. If they moved into their own burrow or if they moved into a vacancy that appeared in another group, which is, and I found the latter. They seemed to move to a group that had some opposite sex conspecifics, not necessarily the most, but some, and few same sex adult conspecifics. So basically, it gave them a good breeding opportunity. I continued this project, fieldwork included, once I started my job because I needed sample size and things like that, and hadn't been able to locate enough nests in the population in one season that I needed to go back and forth a few times. Unfortunately, it wasn't a good place to take students because there was no housing and everything was very expensive, even cheapo motels. So that was kind of the end of the Pineville project, but I was still looking at questions relating to mating and cooperative breeding at that point. Pine voles are described to be in this area where I live, but I've never found any. I've trapped orchards and fields and forest edges around here, not found any pine voles. So I decided to go back to prairie voles because they do better, it seemed to me, from putting them in our small mammal enclosures out at our field station here, a couple miles from campus, and asked similar questions in my early career. So I was looking at the dispersal philopatry versus dispersal aspect, And this was with graduate students. So my idea was that if somebody came to work with me, it should have something to do with my expertise, but also something to do with their interests. So we would come up with projects dealing with cooperative breeding, communal nesting, and nursing, like Lauren's, and so on. So the big framework was cooperative breeding, and then there were various projects under that umbrella, I guess I'd say. At that time in my early career, um, I guess there's more arrows if you click on it again, showing the relationships there. Whoops, not that many arrows. At some point, I realized the funding agencies weren't going to just fund straight behavior. So I began collaborations with some colleagues here and elsewhere to look at genes in brains that provided potential mechanisms for these types of social behaviors. Was doing this in mid-career and then later career as well. So I guess my conclusion is I went from a project for my master's, a main aspect of a project for my dissertation, but then stepped back, looked at the bigger picture, looked at reproductive suppression, movement in the population, and mating, and found out prairie voles were not clear singular or plural breeders. There was mixtures of different things in the population, and started to try to uncover some of the mechanisms underlying that. So I don't know that I planned this, it just kind of happened because of funding opportunities and the pressures in the scientific community to move that way. I might have talked too much there.
Sorry, I had a little technical issue there. Thank you, Nancy. That was great. So what we'll do is next I'll introduce Kathleen. Kathleen Carroll's at the University of Rhode Island. And Kathleen, you want me to share yours for you?
Yeah, that'd be excellent. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. Can you see that okay?
Yes, just not full screen yet.
Great.
Perfect. I did not follow the color code rules. I deviated from the path. As y'all will see, I also didn't do any transitions, but hi, my name's Kathleen. I use she, they pronouns. I am, as Lauren said, at the University of Rhode Island, and I started my undergrad in 2009 at the University of Maine in Orono. So Lauren and I have that Maine connection, but different schools. I started off, I knew from a very young age I wanted to study wildlife, and so it's the only school I applied to, only program I applied to. And then I became a scuba diving instructor in high school, and so I added marine biology only because I liked scuba diving. But it's worked out really well for me. The wildlife program at UMaine is very game warden focused, and so my capstone project there was looking at habitat use for ermine, so small little white weasel there in the photo. And then I also did a honors thesis in marine biology, looking at Charles Darwin's voyage of the Beagle writings in the Galapagos and comparing that to some of kind of our modern knowledge of species in the Galapagos. I went directly from there into a master's program with Lauren at UTC, studying degus and how ecological variables influence social network structure, which ended up being my third project. So I had the scientific joy of coming into Lauren's lab to study voles, and then we were going to do a stress study. Building went under construction, hard to study stress when there's jackhammers running all day, and all your animals are stressed out. And so we pivoted to degus, and then there was a drought, and they had like no babies. And so then we pivoted to a different degu project at Rinconada. And so I got to do this really exciting early kind of intro to science of like, often it goes horribly wrong and you still figure things out and make it happen. And Lauren was really supportive throughout that. He also recently sent me my first grant I ever wrote that I didn't have a copy of anymore. And I was reading it and I was like, wow, I knew what I was talking about. Like, look at me go. It was actually really exciting to see it. I was like, okay. Sometimes you read your old writing and you're like, this is garbage, but I felt okay about this one. Um, I went straight from my master's into my PhD with a little brief stint on the Appalachian Trail between, but at Montana State University with Andy Hansen, who's now retired, studying wolverine habitat quality, connectivity, and prioritization at the landscape scale. And so, background about that project, there was a lawsuit about listing wolverines as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. They are now listed as threatened, but at the time they weren't. There was a lawsuit, and my funding for my PhD was to kind of increase our knowledge about the species, given the lawsuit saying that they should have been listed, and the response being, we don't really know enough about the species. And so I was looking at habitat quality, where they actually are, how their habitat's connected, and kind of concerns for prioritizing habitat. And so I had a really unique experience in my PhD in that I did a fast PhD. I did it in 3 years, and my PhD advisor was on sabbatical for 1/3 of it. And so I had a lot of lessons in kind of learning to develop my own research questions and come up with my own ideas. And then I went into a postdoc after finishing my PhD. I took some time off, and it happened to align very nicely with the height of COVID. So that was really nice to be able to stay home for 7 months and not be stressed out. And I really wanted to kind of broaden my skill set and learn some new techniques. And so I went into a remote sensing and ornithology lab. And I started to there really get a sense of how to ask these really broader questions or frame my research in broader questions. And so having gone from very focused on, having understood that my advisors had really broad questions, I started to think about one of the kind of broad questions that drives my research. It's in that Venn diagram, and it's listed as like spatial data and cutting edge tools, but really this question of why are large scale management products at fine resolutions necessary and challenging? So how do we really balance trade-offs between producing remotely sensed maps at fine resolutions and the trade-offs between like model accuracy and resolution of production of these data layers that are really important to scientists. And after that postdoc, I went into kind of another side. I wanted to develop some camera trapping skills. And so I worked with Indigenous communities in Alberta, based out of the University of Victoria with Jason Fisher, my second postdoc. And I focused on how human impacts, human land use was really how to reconcile human land use and conservation was kind of the big thrust of that, and through the lens of Indigenous use of these resources. And so I studied moose, fur bearers, and edible and medicinal plants. And those were all directly co-produced, co-written by Indigenous community members. And that was a really rewarding part of my career. And I still am engaged in those collaborations. And I actually ran a symposium on Indigenous co-production of knowledge in Australia this past summer with Indigenous community members from Australia, from Canada, and from the US. And so it was really nice to get to kind of amplify those voices in that at that conference. And then in coming to my faculty position, I really started to think about how to take these very disparate experiences that to some might look like just kind of randomly picking up skills, but in my mind, they kind of all complement each other. And I really spend a lot of time now in my faculty position as a quantitative ecologist, right? So I can kind of take any project I want under the guise of it has statistics. But really thinking about a lot of questions on how do species behavior and habitat use influence occupancy and connectivity. And so integrating behavioral principles into the questions I have my students ask. So we do a lot of work thinking about how species respond to human land use, either recreation or structures. We spend a lot of time thinking about how human impacts might modify some of these relationships we see in nature, modify communities. And a lot of work with camera traps, GPS collars. I have students studying like roadkill and habitat connectivity. I have students studying bobcat movement in response to human land use. I I have Emilio who's starting, who's looking at Daegu social questions, which I'm sure he'll talk about more when he gets to his slide. But really kind of thinking about these broad questions of how all of these movement models, all of these space use models are inherently behavioral questions, and how can we ask questions about how humans modify those behaviors, and what does that mean for what we're seeing on the ground in species, habitat use, movement, and connectivity. And I put over here just a couple figures that I made when I was applying for faculty jobs. The flowchart figure was directly from my research statement, and the Venn diagram was from my presentation when I was interviewing for faculty jobs. And all of those materials are available for folks that are considering faculty positions on my website. I have all of my materials that I was hired with freely available. So, thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen. That's cool to see. All right, so next I'm going to go to Xavier. I didn't get it in time, so can you run it through your computer?
Yeah. 1 second. All right. Can everyone see that? All good?
Yes.
Okay.
That's good.
Awesome. Lot more brief than the previous two, just because I'm still working on my PhD. But I did my Bachelor's of Science in Biological Sciences at Old Dominion University. I started in 2018. In undergrad, I was kind of our biological science program was split between people who wanted to be a nurse or a doctor and everyone else. But luckily we have Old Dominion itself is located on the Chesapeake Bay, so there's a really big a lot of the biology department also focuses on wetland restoration. So I was able to do an undergrad project looking at habitat homogenization in swamplands around the university. And in general, I'm the only plant person on this panel, but in general, I've always been interested in studying plants. And then in undergrad, I took 2 courses that looked at plant defenses, and that really interested me. And so I initially applied for a master's at Virginia Tech in the Whitehead lab. And then I did a few years and then decided to switch over to a PhD. But at Virginia Tech now, I'm looking at the environmental drivers of fruit secondary chemistry. So um, this it's been a lot. I have done a few projects, the first two being a sampling regime across the entirety of the west coast of the United States, looking at differences between organic and conventional apples, using like huge climate data sets, a lot of driving, a lot of apples eaten. And then also looking at how the apple microbiomes differ across this latitudinal gradient as well. So kind of two very different types of projects within the same study system. And then I'm also interested in plant defense theory. So why do plants produce the chemicals they do to defend themselves? So I did a pretty cool greenhouse experiment looking at increased herbivore species richness and its effect on the chemistry of reproductive structures in strawberries. And then now I should be finishing up this spring, hopefully, if everything goes to plan. Right now, I'm currently one of Dr. Hayes' students in Chile, helping assist with the NSF IRES, looking at Daegu seed dispersal, whether or not they disperse seeds. Still haven't figured that out yet. And I'm kind of in a weird transitionary period of being a PhD student where right now I'm actively applying for postdocs, and just with like the nature of all of the wonderful funding cuts that we've seen in the United States, looking at potential industry jobs where I can still take on research, but everything's really volatile right now. So I'm just trying to keep my options open. That's it
Thanks.
for me.
Thanks, Xavier. So next I'll go Emilio. Emilio, I'll share yours if you'd like. There we go. So good, Emilio?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
All right. So, yeah, my name is Emilio, and I did my undergrad from 2021 to 2024 at the University of Florida. And well, I initially started as a pre-veterinary student, but through the wonderful ways of the world, ended up in ecology. So really my first I conducted 3 projects as an undergrad that kind of spanned different areas of behavioral ecology. The first was part of an NSF IRIS in Sichuan, China, where I got to analyze an existing data set looking of camera trap data looking at giant panda scent marking behavior. And I analyzed it to see if there's a potential for interspecific communication with sympatric mammals. Then, as part of my just general interests in at UF, I joined an amphibian ecology lab where I conducted a study looking at changes in acoustic activity window for coqui frogs in Puerto Rico across an elevational gradient. So looking at all the different ecological factors that varied across the gradient, and then seeing how those led to changes in the duration and intensity of calling activity for these frogs. And then finally, I participated in a second NSF IRIS in Eswatini in South Africa, where I looked at the behavioral response of ungulates, mostly Impala and Nyala, in response to mechanical bush clearing in bush encroached savanna ecosystems. And that project ended up being really exciting because we found that an invasive plant that was moving into these cleared areas was actually being eaten by ungulates, but it had been previously thought that it was toxic to those ungulates. So that was a really exciting finding. And also, I don't know, I learned a lot about how, a project can shift dramatically and still succeed. After graduating in December of 2024, I participated as a field tech in a master's student thesis looking at the effects of invasive pythons in the Everglades and looking at how different small mammal communities have been disappearing, if not just reducing in numbers. And then finally, I ended up joining this NSF IRIS. And I plan on conduct a study in my master's looking at the socio-ecological factors affecting the size of group home ranges in Dagus. So we're using a lot of different techniques, including live trapping, camera trapping to document behavior, nighttime telemetry, and ecological surveys to quantify all the different social and ecological factors. And we're also deploying GPS collars to get the home range data for different social groups. And under Kathleen's advisement at the University of Rhode Island, I will hopefully analyze all this data and complete the project. Moving forward in my career, I kind of just hope to incorporate all of these different experiences, and ultimately the goal is to impact conservation sciences. So yeah, I aim to end up in an academic position where I can contribute to this field while also mentoring future generations of scientists. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Emilio. And again, last but not least, Autumn, I can share your
Please.
file
Thank you.
here. And then go ahead.
Sweet. Hello, everyone. Excited to be here. First and foremost, I have to thank the Kratt brothers for sparking my curiosity in everything biology. So for my undergrad, I pursued the EcoBio track at Sewanee, the University of the South. There, the herpetology lab played a pivotal role in shaping my research interest. An exciting project that I worked on my freshman year was the chemical versus visual cues exhibited by the triangle crayfish and the defenses that the two-lined salamander exhibited in response. So that was exciting. Another project, it was a long-term monitoring study on the tiger salamander. Sewanee has 13,000 acres, and out on Brinkfield Road, there is a vernal pool, and in the spring, we would go and sample for their breeding monitoring program. Super exciting. Last summer, I participated in the island ecology program. There, we explored several subdisciplines of biology, ranging from ornithology, landscape and wildlife ecology, to invertebrate zoology. Each week was designated to a different study area and just very immersive. Lots of hands-on experiences. As you see, I got to handle juvenile alligators, and it was very fast-tracked, which is great, right? A lot of adapting in the moment, and teamwork, and having to shift your research objectives for time's sake. So that was great. And then last fall, I was in Kenya at this time, studying through the School for Field Studies. There, we focus specifically on endangered species conservation, directly engaging with the local Maasai communities to gain insight on the human dimension aspects of conservation. And that was incredibly fulfilling. Originally, I had went to Kenya with this just grand desire to see all of the megafauna, and that was checked off the list. But the people really captivated my heart, and just seeing the larger work of conservation and how local communities play such a pivotal role in that. So in addition to the behavioral ecology of the megafauna within the Amboseli ecosystem, we were able to collect qualitative survey data from local Maasai communities, which came together in my directed research, where I examined the socioeconomic and ecological drivers of giraffe bushmeat trade within the Amboseli ecosystem. So now here we are in Chile, and it's an honor to be here. Next spring, I'll start collecting data for my master's thesis, where I'll investigate how anogenital distance variation within female degus and environmental harshness shapes social dominance, social cohesion, as well as access to food. So digressing a little bit and explaining more, AGD variation is a postnatal proxy for masculinization. And I'll examine whether females with larger AGDs are more dominant within these matriarchies, as well as examining and teasing apart social cohesion. I'll see if there is, if social interactions support the idea of AGD homophily. And then in terms of access to food, teasing that apart, seeing how environmental harshness moderates the relationship between AGD traits, as well as burrow access to food resources. Also, a little side quest for next season, I want to gain insight from nearby Chilean communities on their perceptions of degus and endemic wildlife, as well as see what role climate change has had on land usage here. Zooming out and looking forward to the great unknown, I may potentially pursue a PhD if that opportunity opens, or work for a nonprofit centered on community-based conservation. I was really fortunate last year for Expedition, the SFS program traveled to Rwanda, and we got to study at the Dian Fossey Foundation, where they, a pillar of their conservation efforts was directly on gaining community support, where they actually employed ex-poachers within their research mission. So it was just really insightful and gives me a lot of hope for the direction I may take. Thank you.
All right, thank you all. Thank you all for those presentations. So what I'd like to do now is just have the panel sort of discuss a little bit. We have about 10, 15 minutes for that, and then we'll transition over to questions coming from the FIND community. So I think the idea of this part of the panel is just to gain further insight into the process. And I'm going to let the direction go based on the questions that are asked. So I thought it'd be good first to, ask the students, do you have questions for one of the faculty that's on the panel? So just raise your hand and go ahead and ask. Go ahead. Autumn, go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you. Very broad question. So I was wondering, what was the largest challenge encountered from transitioning from an undergraduate program to a graduate level program?
Kathleen or Nancy?
I'm happy to answer. Xavier and Emilio have done this more recently and are living this experience too. So their opinions, I think, are also giving them a chance to weigh in on this. But I will just say I found my transition to a master's really easy because Lauren was very available and supportive. But then transitioning to a PhD was very challenging because I felt like I went from a smaller school to like a much larger school, and there were a bunch of like kind of hidden curriculum aspects that I didn't understand or know very well. And I think just finding people that are willing to talk about kind of those things of like, I didn't know what comprehensive exams were because they weren't a thing at UTC and there wasn't a PhD program. So I'd never heard of a comprehensive exam. I had no idea what I was supposed to be doing. And I was terrified when I read the student handbook, and I was like, oh no, they're going to lock me in a room for a week and make me fill out questions. And then they're going to lock me in a different room with a bunch of people that are going to ask me about those things that I just wrote down. And so just like it was more just all the little things that I didn't have any family that were academics. I didn't have a family that pursued higher education. And so I had no idea what I was in for.
Other panelists?
Yeah, I agree with the hidden curriculum aspect, where like if you're not familiar with the hidden curriculum, there are aspects of academia that aren't explicitly told to you. Whether taking comprehensive exams, or I'm trying to think of another good example of like scheduling meetings with committee members, how to find your committee. Those things aren't taught to you. You have to figure them out on your own, and a lot of times you figure them out right at the brink of time or a little too late, and that can be really challenging to navigate. I also think that for me specifically, like when I started off as a master's student, I had a project given to me, which was super nice. And then when I made the transition to a PhD student, the training wheels were kind of taken off, where I was expected to figure out a lot more on my own and figure out how to develop my last couple of chapters. And so it's a lot of work. It's also extremely rewarding though.
Nancy, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, in response to some of the things that Kathleen and Xavier were just saying, I found when I went to graduate school for my PhD at the University of Illinois, it was just a PhD department. I think it was very different for master's students there, and not as good in support. But the students that were all senior to us, um, in terms of like comprehensive exams specifically, they had a file that you were expected when you came out of your written, oh no, ours were just orals then, thank goodness. After your orals, when you were totally brain dead, you were supposed to write down a couple questions that you remembered being asked and who the people were that asked them, that were on the committee that year, to help other students. And in preparing, the students would share this file with you, which was more helpful if the faculty had been on the committee recently. So we had a couple people that hadn't served on the committee in who knows how long, and they were kind of unknowns in terms of the aspects of questions they would ask, like, okay, here's Dr. Batsley. He's going to be the ecologist, what kind of things is he going to ask? Who knows? But they're going to be really tough because that's how he is. And they would kind of quiz us and help us get ready, supposedly, for these oral exams. So I think community, as in the community of grad students, support was really, really helpful because I didn't have to do comprehensive for my master's, just a thesis. And I wasn't as worried about the dissertation so much because I'd done a thesis and that gave me some idea of what I had to do there.
Great.
So
So, go
let
ahead.
me just say one last thing. One of the things I took away from that and some other things I learned at Illinois is anytime I had to do something new, like write my first grant proposal as a faculty member here at Miami, I would ask for samples from people. And it's like find out what the structure, what the expectations were, ask around people who had just done it successfully, and then go from there. And I did this for ages, with different aspects of things I had to do in my career. I don't know, Lauren, when you were there, I don't know if I had a file. I thought I had some samples maybe, but maybe you were too early for
I don't remember the file. I don't remember the folder with files, to be honest.
Okay.
But we certainly, one thing that I took advantage of was, Nancy's success in getting grants, and spent a lot of time just talking about grant writing and what that meant. And it was, I think that was probably one of the biggest skills that I developed as a PhD student, was being able to write a convincing argument that you should fund me. And in the US, where, particularly challenging now, but historically the big funding comes from the National Science Foundation for our field. And, those are 15-page documents that are really detailed and are very, very competitive, sometimes as low as less than 10% are funded. What I did was I learned how to write grants and how to advise grants through conversations with Nancy, but then also I served on a Mammal Society panel, the grant committee on the GRRA, as they call them for mammals, to help me understand the review process. And then as a professor, I get travel to Washington, D.C. to serve on panels to understand the review process there. Now, I'll just, at this may be a good point to state this. I got an email from Jane Waterman, who's in Canada, and Jane told me that the funding system, the NSECR, Canadian funding is very different. They tend to fund more broadly across the country, but the funding levels are much lower. So if you go to Canada to work, there's a whole nother, process you got to learn. But I think that's one of the critical skills you have to learn wherever you are to try and fund a project is get the funding for it. So I would emphasize learn that skill early on.
And I would say at that level, at the NSF level, or even National Institute of Health, any of those big grants in this country, at least, you have to put together a small program because it has to have 3 to 5 aims, more or less, which are your goals for different projects in there, and they have to be related.
Are there any, let's go with other questions. One of the other students, Emilio, go ahead.
Thinking kind of broadly about choosing a research project that can develop into a research program, how do you go about like identifying the system or the species that you want to work with and ensuring that like it can provide a plethora of like innovation through like a long period of time?
Lauren, I think you should start this one with the Daegu work.
Well, I guess the quick answer is I was interested in a plural breeder, a communal breeder. And in part because there were very few very few communal breeders have been studied in natural systems at the time that I was interested. And then, then it also became a little bit of luck too. I reached out to Luis and he was actually interested. I was trying to be Luis's postdoc actually, and I got lucky. And he expressed interest, and I didn't get the postdoc funding, but then I got a job somehow. I don't know how that happened, but I got a job, and then Luis and I just kept communicating. It became very clear to me that the Daegu was going to be a species that we knew just enough about to get started, but not enough to, we didn't know much at all. So I could argue as an understudied species. And so that was my process with the Daegus.
That's definitely like a really nice linear. Mine is a little different now, in that given that my applied is the first word in my title, right? I'm the applied quantitative ecologist. So I was brought in under the assumption that I would be doing tangible conservation on the ground in collaboration with state managers. And so a lot of my money comes from our Department of Environmental Management, the DEM, and they have things that they care about. And what they care most about are species that can be funded under Pittman Robinson funds, which are hunting and trapping. And so I am constrained to in the sense of if I want to get funding from them, right? I apply for like NSF grants as well, and I can ask questions that are much more fundamental. But if I want to think about a research program with the DEM, I have to balance both like species that they care about and they have questions about with things that are interesting to me and trying to align some of those. So for instance, the DEM, one of their biggest priorities is bobcats in Rhode Island. Bobcats are currently not trappable. They want them to be, and they're the only mesocarnivore that's native that is increasing. So medium-sized predator for those. Mesocarnivore is a word I use a lot. And then I realized recently talking to a marine biologist that it is in fact a very jargony word. And so like our foxes declining, fishers declining, coyotes are technically neonative. But so they want to know why. And I want to know if there's some additional flexibility in bobcats' ability to tolerate anthropogenic impacts and living close to humans and what that means kind of for their behavioral flexibility as generalists. And so I've begun thinking about ways to expand these broader questions about comparing species that are potentially more behaviorally flexible in response to humans to species that are less. And then I started thinking about, well, how do we bring physiology into this? Well, we have 2 fox species here. So I wrote an NSF career grant. How do we incorporate physiology and behavior into movement models in species that have overlapping ranges, diets, all of these different things? And so taking local mesocarnivores, taking my interest in finding ways that they interact, but then also still being able to say, hey, here's how many bobcats there are. Here's what bobcats are doing in the state for the DEM, which is at the end of the day is what they care about, right? Like, are there enough for us to kill them is what they care about. And what I care about is all of the scientific questions. And so finding ways to kind of make those play nice together is sometimes the hardest, but also I'm always asking myself, like, what would they care about that they might give me some money for that I also care about and I can ask for more fundamental movement questions or habitat use questions on.
Kathleen, may I ask a question about departmental expectations, I guess, for promotion and tenure and stuff? So what does your department expect?
I just co-wrote the promotion and tenure document. So we have a very vague, so we are kind of at a weird instance where, so URI has always been an R2, so a high research, but not very high research. R1s are like the highest you can get in the US for research production. We just transitioned to an R1. And so there's this kind of push to bring in more PhD students, do more research, and get more money coming from our admin. Generally, what I was told is if you're doing stuff for research, teaching, and service, and you're not drastically either ignoring parts of your jobs or not trying or like offending people or doing horrible things, you should get tenured. I think of the 100 last faculty members hired by the dean, 98 of them got tenured. One of them spent all of his startup money on equipment and never published a single paper. And I don't think anyone in his department knew what he did. And the other one just kept getting feedback every year of like change these things and then just never changed their behavior. But generally, for those of you considering academia, there are guidelines in theory provided by your department, unless you get to write them yourselves, about like what you have to do. And so we came up with a list of things. I'm happy to kind of talk about that more with people in depth if they have questions, but that is kind of a very not only like department focus, but college focus, university focus. There's always some guidelines, but they always vary.
And in my experience, when I was starting, they were very vague about them. Like they would not explicitly say, you have to publish so many papers and get so many dollars to be tenured and promoted, either or. But you could look at the people that, well, what I did was looked at the last cohort. So people that started basically 3 years before me. There was somebody who was so exceptional that I ignored him, and said, like, okay, what do the ones that look more average, what did they have to do for tenure? Because here too, most everybody gets it, but there have been some cases over time. Unfortunately, they were all women. I don't know if it's a gender thing or if there's something else, that other things that played into that too, because I was only here for the last one and she didn't get any money and she didn't publish. And here we're a doctoral institution, so we don't have the high expectations of an R1, but I looked around and said, if I could publish 1 or 2 papers a year and get at least one major grant or the amount of money adding up to that, that looks like that would work. But then you need some luck and help and community and
Yeah, and we were very diligent in when we wrote, we did not provide any dollar amounts or publications, and we added the clause of like, it's all contingent upon current administration policies and like the availability of funding for researchers. Like we added clear verbiage to basically protect new faculty that are impacted by kind of societal problems outside of their control.
Yeah, that's good, because I don't know what new faculty here are going to do. But one person they're interviewing for is at a very high senior level. So, but yeah, they're hiring one more at a junior level. So we'll see. But I think that's something else that impacts development of a research program and things like that, is what you have to do depending on the type of job and funding availability.
No, definitely. Like here, there's no expectation that we have to get an NSF grant to get tenure. But if you went to UW-Madison, you're not going to get tenure without an NSF or NASA or some higher level grant from a federal agency.
And to follow up on that, where I am, Eduardo, I'll get in just a second. Where I am, I'm at mostly a teaching institution. Our grants, the IRIS project is both educational and research based. Has been perfectly fine here, whereas a big school might not because of the lack of overhead. With that, I want to open this up. I want to open this up to questions from the audience too. So if you're in the audience, you want to ask a question, please just post a question mark in the chat, and then I'll call on you. And if you are in YouTube, please just post your question in YouTube, and I'll put that forward to any of the panelists. And as you ask a question, please just tell us your name and where you're from and your one-line research, because we want to build community and get to know each other and hopefully build collaboration. So I'm looking in the chat, and the first, Eduardo, why don't you go ahead? You've got a question mark in there for. You're on.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Kathleen. Well, everyone, interesting. I mean, very motivating is seeing the young faces and hoping that one can say something that can help you guys. So a couple of things that we're talking about funding, we're talking about publishing, we're talking about tenure. I always tell students that you have to, it's not just only about getting the grant. My opinion is that a grant proposal is the most serious piece of writing that I'll read from my colleague. I don't think more and more, I always tell the students that you'll get your work published somewhere. What we have is an abundance of journals. Some journal will publish it. It is not the same with the grants. So those grants, people are going to read them in a way that has been my experience. I'm much happier with the process of reviewing grants that I've been part of than of reviewing papers. And so that's where you let others know how you're thinking, what your plans are, your program, your project. You make yourself known. So moving on to tenure, whenever I have a chance, I keep saying that we have to start assessing not only whether people got the grants or not, but if they submitted them, and if they got reviews, and if the reviews were positive. I mean, I don't remember the last time that I got an NSF. I've been funded by NSF almost nonstop for the last 20 years, but I don't think I ever got it in the first try. And so when I would report to my institution my grant writing, I would say all the times that I had to write it back, because they may have been positive, but there you go again, and there you go again. And that speaks of diligence, speaks of commitments, speaks of you working hard to get the funding. Because so many times excellent proposals don't get funded. So that's important that you explore with your institution how you can communicate your attempts and how your grant proposals were received, even if you did not get the funding. The other thing that in making the distinction between project and program, which one day you realize that maybe you have a program, you started with a project, we don't know what that happens. You have to get organized with databases. You have to get organized, assuming that you may be in this game for 20, 30, 40 years. So be organized, keeping track of the students you advise, of the grants you write, everything from the go in an organized manner that's compatible with the standards that journals, societies, and funding agencies demand. What you're going to have is the ages of shortage of data are gone with all the technologies impacting our research. Most of us are finding ourselves how to distinguish good data from bad data and other elements of the process, not the data per se. So yes, assume that you'll be in the game for a long time. Don't think that this is just this year, because then there's no catching up with having your things organized. Thanks.
I totally agree. Those are excellent suggestions. Thank you, Eduardo.
Great. Thanks, Eduardo. That was really great advice. Clara, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you who are participating. I'm Clara Jones, Clara B. Jones, Social Evolution, retired. Before I ask my question, Dr. Solomon, I just want you to know that your work has been really important to me, and I appreciate all of the publications that I've read, so thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. My question regards LLMs and your use of AI in your research programs. I want to know whether or not you're using LLMs, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini. If so, how it's contributing, if you're not using it, why? And just a few words.
I can go first if you want, Lauren.
Go ahead, Kathleen, please.
Yes. So I teach two types of classes that are kind of very well, in my opinion, they're very closely related, but some people might consider them very disparate. Ecological philosophy and multiple statistics classes, grad and undergrad statistics. And we talk about, in ecological philosophy, one of our topics is the costs and benefits of using large language models and generative AI for ecology, for natural resources, given the cost to natural resources and the trade-offs of what we learn from it. I do in my stats class, and that's for my ecological philosophy students to kind of parse out for themselves. In my stats class, the students are encouraged to, in their debugging of their code, consider AI as one of the ways that they work to debug. And what we do is the first class of every semester, we have a conversation where we come up with shared agreement about what is appropriate and inappropriate use of AI. It's here, it's going to stay. It might impact our jobs in the way that the internet once impacted professors' jobs of transitioning us from the knowledge keepers to the knowledge disseminators in kind of a different way. But I don't think that using AI, I think that AI is here to stay, and using it intelligently and training our students how to use it ethically is important. And so the short answer is yes. I encourage my students that are learning to code in R to use AI to help them debug, but they also know they're not supposed to write any original content, and that they are supposed to understand what they're getting from those AIs and to check it, because we go through all of the ways that it can be vastly wrong.
Okay. Nancy, you said no.
I have not used it for anything in my research, because by the time I guess it got pretty common, I was pretty much done, I think, writing up my research. My data was all analyzed. In the last couple years since I retired, I wrote up some final papers that I wanted to. There's still more questions I could ask of the data sets, but I don't right now have plans to do so. So it was partly a matter of timing, partly a matter of I didn't know enough to use it wisely. And I've taken some classes and read about the large language models and AI. And I guess because I could do it other ways, I would probably just continue to do what I've done if I went back and wrote some more or reanalyzed data. And I don't write code, so I don't have to worry about that.
Okay, thank you. How about go ahead.
No, I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay, how about the students?
I can share a little bit for myself. I learned how to code prior to AI or like large language models taking off. So from my perspective, I use ChatGPT mostly for debugging my codes. But I think, like, even as a graduate teaching assistant, like whenever I have students and I'm teaching them something, I'm like, don't use AI if you're learning, because you need to learn how everything works prior to being able to prior to using that, so that you know when it's wrong. So there's plenty of times when I run into an issue, I'll just throw it into ChatGPT, see what it suggests, and I'll be like, no, that's not right. So then I know from there that I probably need to go read the CRAN repository, or like find another example written by a human. So I don't foresee it I mean, it's here to stay, like Kathleen said. I don't foresee it being this kind of end all be all and letting people get away with stuff that they shouldn't be able to, because at the end of the day, like, you can see who knows what they're writing and what they're producing and who doesn't. So it's just an added layer of, it's just another tool at this point. But I always emphasize that you need to know what you're doing prior to using it to help you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I
Thanks
might
a
add a
lot.
little bit, Clara, if you want. I mean, sorry, Adriana Maldonado, professor at Universidad de Rosario and studying social behavior as well. And so I was just gonna say at my university, I mean, the use of AI, I think it's even been, how can I say this? Like, they encourage students to use it, and in our hands, professors, I think our goal nowadays is to actually teach them how to properly use the resources. I mean, they are there and they are not going to go away. So there is an ethics in the use of AI. So I think that's what we need to teach them nowadays. And as Xavier was saying as well, I mean, there's a lot of things that we ask AI and it's just not correct. So we also need to be very careful on what we get from AI. Very critical. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks, Claire. Great question. Does anyone else want to reply to that? Anyone in the group? David, I saw you, maybe?
Yeah, I was just gonna say I'm David Wood. I'm in my 7th year at Yale. I'm working with Eduardo Fernandez Duque on behavior and energetics of biparental care and the TT monkey. And I am really bad at coding, and I don't have very complicated codes to make. So it's really easy for me to just ask ChatGPT to, like, how do I save this kind of file in this way? And so I'm using it for very simple things like that I'm pretty confident I can step through the code and make sure that any kind of modification that it's doing, I agree with. But I just don't have to learn any syntax.
Thank you.
You can
Actually,
come take my coding class if you want.
I'll come. I need to learn that.
Everyone come take my coding classes.
The last thing I want to say is we all have been using it for a long time, you know, in doing Google searches and so on. I don't think about that really, but
So if that conversation is completed, if it isn't, please pipe up. If not, I had a question for actually Adriana. Adriana, so a lot of the discussion has been kind of from the base of the United States, right? These are the entire panel is U.S. institutions. You're not a U.S. institution. What was sort of your take from all of it, and what advice would you have that's more global, more broad?
Oh, well, okay. So
Heavy question. Sorry.
I mean, I had the probably pleasure, and also I've been lucky. I did my PhD in the USA and my postdoc in Europe, in Germany, and I've also got the luxury of teaching in both countries. And now I moved back to Colombia in South America, where the academic system is quite different from both Europe and Northern America. So first advice is you need to really know the system that you want to apply for. I mean, the rules are different in all of these 3 countries that I've been in. The rules are different for each of them. Even the language that we use for applications, like in the USA, it's, like everything before Trump, everything that was directly with diversity, inclusion, and it was really important. A language that probably just recently, very recently, started to be important in South America. So we've really never had to write anything like a diversity statement or perhaps a teaching statement. Our applications were more about our CVs. And so I think just the universities that are higher up in the rank within our country are getting more into this, let's say, North American way of thinking, because it's basically USA-driven way of thinking of like, yeah, now you need to write a teaching statement, and then you need to present a class, and we're going to have a panel, and we're going to, we all as a committee, we're going to grade you and see how it goes. It might be different in other countries, even though Colombia, it's well positioned in academy. I would say that, I mean, Mexico, Argentina, Chile, and Brazil, they are even better and stronger in both research and university-wise. They have stronger PhD programs for a longer time than Colombia. So they might have different schemes as well that I'm not quite familiar with. So yeah, read a lot about, or talk to people, talk to colleagues. How is it in there? As for materials, successful ones, hopefully. I know those are harder to get. In Colombia, there is a lot of heterogeneity in what is expected from you as a professor. But I would say that the top universities are now aiming to be better placed as a research institution, even though it's not like an R1. We have a heavy teaching load, so it's more like a teaching institution in the US, but with more commitment to research than a teaching institution in the USA. So they are expecting us to publish high impact papers, to get funding from external sources, have international collaborations, supervise the students, and yeah, like any perhaps R1, but with at least 40% of teaching load. So yeah, it's a challenge. I hope I'm not very extended in my answer, but I hope it helps.
Thank you. That's I'm glad, because that brings a more broader view on it. And I think Filippo has a comment that will bring another international perspective. And then I see David Fisher is next. So Filippo, can you please add to that?
Yeah. Thank you. This is Filippo Aureli from Universidad Veracruzana in Mexico. So I have a bit a similar perspective of Adriana, but it's a bit different because Mexico is a little bit ahead in that respect of Adriana. And it's a system that I think possibly is one of the best university systems in the world when it works. Okay, it's much better than the one in the US because of all the issues that you have mentioned. If you want to do research, my background is that the other way around of Adriana. So I did the PhD in Europe and then postdoc in the US. Then I went back and teach and having a faculty position in the UK, and then decided to move to Mexico to have a better life. And so I can give, so I think it, as all of you have recognized, the discussion was very center US-wise, and I think it was good for the people on the US. I don't think it was very useful for anybody else, I must say, because it was very, very technical. It's so different in other places that it doesn't really compare. The key issue that I thought it was going to be discussed more was to move from your PhD project to a program on that, like Lawrence mentioned at the very beginning in his case and so on. And instead of discussion, when not that. In that respect, I think it would have been much easier. I think it would have been many more comparison across the world on similarities, because it's tricky to do it. And I think it's not only to find a position, even when you have a position, is how you keep going on that. So the funding issues and so on, those are the key things that are universal. And I think they are fantastic examples of researchers that have been giving presentation in the FIND seminars that have been able to do that. Some even be able to do twice the changes. So they have been starting with one particular system from their PhD. They did for a few years and then they moved to a different one. Okay, and so how you do that and so on. So the Tim Clattenbrock is one of those examples. You know, he had been famous from meerkats nowadays, and most of you guys know it. But he did stuff on red deer, you know, to begin with, and primates even. You know, so it's you can change that. I think that is the big challenge, and I think that is something that apart from your position, because we heard the people that have the possibility to do research in the industry, that they have possibility to do research while you are in a very teaching focused university or much more research-oriented university. You can always do. The challenge is be the same for everybody, to how to move from your PhD program, if you want to do continuity in PhD project, if you want to continue to do in the same area, to move that to a PhD, to a research program. So from a research project to a research program. So I think that's mainly how to scale it out, how you fund it, and things like that. If you that was more my general contribution, and I think that is more similar. If you want to know a little bit about the situation in Mexico, I can tell a few things that is more related to what Adriana mentioned about the Colombia situation and how different it is from the US. Shall I add a few words on that? Okay. So here is a very, very clear split between, within the same university, there are, now the terminology is very difficult. What is here called faculty are the departments in the US, okay? Or the schools in the UK. So they're not the people, but they actually are the things they are working. So we have the departments that they teach at the undergraduate level, and the institute that teach master and PhD level. And most of the PhD, we heard that terrible number of 7 years PhD program, poor you guy, that is not done in that way. I think the US is really not very good in that system. And also the tenure track position, the US is a nightmare. So I think those two things are really bad. Like, while students are, I feel like they are employed for free for doing a lot of other stuff and keeping their PhD for so long. We have 4 years fully granted in Mexico. That's it. You get 4 years of money to do your PhD, and you manage to do it. You don't need to do many courses because you have done them all at master level. Then you start at PhD and you do it. And that is my job, that I'm a teacher. I'm a teach and employed at the institute. I basically supervise master and PhD projects. That's basically my job. Most of my job. So I do mostly research, and so then the challenge is how to run the research program. But you don't need to worry too many other things. There's funding issues, of course, but I think the system and how the tenure is done in our country, in a country here in Mexico. No, I'm not talking about, I'm Italian, and that's an awful system in Italy, so I'm not dealing with that. But in Mexico, I mean, the fact that for the master and the PhD program, you have funding for the students, and it's not only for Mexican students. There are a lot of Colombia students coming, and we have students from Europe as well. It's more difficult from the US because of the master. There are very few master program in the US that they could form a master student to come to Mexico, but maybe also because there's a kind of a different view in Europe. They don't mind to come to Mexico to do their PhD. Maybe in the US, they think that the Mexican go to the US to do a PhD. In fact, it's true. Most of probably the better Mexican student go to abroad, and so we actually are going to get students from abroad because the Mexican student, the good students, go away. So it's a big mixture. So I'm stopping here. Sorry about blah blah blah. But I hope I gave you kind of a different view, and I think there is a potential by looking around of finding a niche to move what was a PhD research project to a research program for a longer P.
Thanks, Filippo. I mean, that was great. I mean, you highlighted multiple countries and brought it back to the central question. That's awesome. Next is David Fisher. And again, just to remind folks, David is our speaker next week. So that's a good segue. David, go ahead.
Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, David Fisher, University of Aberdeen. Yeah, I guess in terms of what I've got like some thoughts on what people have said, and then I'm going to pose a question back to the panel, I think, if that's all right. So in terms of well, in terms of pressure to get promoted, one of the things that's becoming more apparent in the UK, at least, is especially because government funding is slowly becoming a smaller and smaller fraction of overall funding in the university system here, that staff need to a bit justify their existence based on finances. So if it'd be more or less explicit at different institutions, but are you teaching enough students where the fee income could be considered to cover your salary, your overheads? Are you bringing in enough grant money so that the overheads cover your salary? And if a grant is from a society or a charity that doesn't bring in overheads, then it's way less valued than something from a government funder that does bring in overheads. Now, it depends on your management in a particular institution, how much pressure it is, how overtly financial it is, but that's definitely there. It's definitely out there. And I feel like it's not ideal from a research environment perspective, but I understand why it exists. Without more government funding, there's no real other way a university management can possibly steer a university, it feels, without relying on the business department to basically fund every other department in the university, which is a bit gross as well. In terms of progression here, starting from a PhD, our PhDs are much shorter than in the US and even shorter than in Canada. 3.5, 4 years is pretty much all you're getting. And so it's basically impossible to then turn that into like whatever project you do there into a program. The thing the UK in particular suffers with is a lack of entry-level fellowships beyond the PhD PhD program. So as someone finishing a PhD, in our field, it's very, very unlikely you can get money to then go and do what you want next. The vast majority, the independent fellowships, you're only going to be competitive if you've got like 2 to 4 years postdoc experience under your belt, and you're coming in with like a impressive series of a few publications, some other like conference attendance grants, that kind of thing. So in the UK, I can't speak for the rest of Europe because annoyingly our system's different and becoming more different over time. The much more common system is that after your PhD, you do a couple of postdocs based on someone else's grant. So a more senior PI has won money. You do that. Hopefully over time, you develop your independence, you gain skills that no one else has. You build an appreciation of study systems that you can work on. And then only after those postdocs do you apply for your own money through a few independent fellowship schemes to then establish your own kind of a larger project, which can then become a program. And now I actually didn't do that. I applied for like a junior faculty position at Aberdeen, and it may be possible to go directly from someone else's postdoc to those kind of positions or via the independent fellowships. It's kind of those are the two options. And then from then you can progress to permanent position, to developing your research program based on 6 to 8 years now of postdoctoral research that really equips you to be able to make the decisions about what system, what questions, how is it going to be funded, and so on. And so something I'd like to ask people now, I guess, is what their opinions or views are on the balance between getting to know a study system really, really well. So being basically, I'm the person who studies this animal, this small group of animals, versus a subject area, like I'm really good at social network analysis, or I'm the person to talk to about molecular pathways underpinning hormone production. And then you take that across a range of different systems. Like, what are the pros and cons for setting up a research program for being more species oriented, where maybe you have a set study site and you know exactly where your animals are every year and you've got to work out how to study them, versus kind of like conceptual area dominated and where you might work on different species depending on what your question is. Yeah, what were your thoughts on those two ways of thinking about things?
Great question. Xavier, please go ahead.
Yeah, I feel like that's been like a point of contention my entire PhD is like, yeah, the you're supposed to be the subject matter expert in a specific system, but at least anecdotally for me, I've seen more people brought into just like the broader question and apply it to different systems and then carry that into their postdocs. I think me personally, I like two of my chapters of my dissertation are on apples, and to study apples for the rest of my life doesn't sound quite as enticing, but my broader interest is in plant defense theory, so all plants defend themselves, so it's a lot easier to take that skill set and put it into other systems and ask some questions that have been asked in other systems and potentially find new questions knowing more broadly about a bunch of different systems. And that's like kind of touching base on what you were talking about with like the postdocs and the funding situation in the UK, where we kind of have, at least to my understanding, because I'm going through the whole postdoc application process right now, is where we have historically had fellowships where you can design your own program and receive funding from whether an institution or a government agency and kind of implement that program under the supervision of a principal investigator at a university, essentially just having them give input on your projects, serve as like a mentor, and then you get the added benefit of being able to use most of their equipment. Um, I've started to not want to pursue that as much now, just for at least like, the first year of postdocing, because I want to try a new, like be introduced into a new system and gain more skill sets to kind of broaden the skill set I have, kind of like Kathleen's whole career trajectory of just learning a bunch of different things to eventually be able to take my broader interests and my broader questions and apply them to different fields. It's kind of a two-parter merged question or answer.
I personally think it really just depends on the species in the system. So like, in thinking about, I was actually thinking about this before the seminar, how Lauren has spent, years studying degus and how there's so many still questions in reading, Emilio's proposal he's working on right now to answer on degus. And because they're such a good model species for some of these questions, they do a lot of really cool things. Maybe for some of the species I study, they could be that as well, but a lot of them are either like the funding would be challenging to get because they're not like a traditional model species. There's really hard to get a decent sample size, right? Like catching a bobcat, if you catch a bobcat, you are never catching that bobcat again. It will never go into a trap again, and I gotta get rid of this dog. It'll never go into a trap again in its life. Like they just don't. They get smart and they refuse. So your sample size is however many novel or naive bobcats you can get. And there's not a lot of good questions you can ask with that type of data, and it makes it a really hard species to kind of do. You can ask some interesting things and maybe you can recycle that data, but I don't know that I could build my career on bobcats the way that folks have on degus or on voles. Alternatively, me and the watershed ecologist are pitching stone walls of New England as a model system for assessing the impacts of anthropogenic land use, historic land use on biodiversity from soil microbes up through small mammals. And I think that's one of those questions that people could potentially build a career on, right? Like there's so many things you could ask about, like these remnant stone walls that exist across New England. 70% of the land was historically farmed at some point in history. It's all grown back in the last 100 years. What does that mean for the way that we think about biodiversity, and how do these serve as potential refugia for plants, for mosses, for everything, right? Like there's I could come up with a million questions in that system that are addressable questions. And I think that might be the key here, is how many questions can you ask that you could reasonably address and or would be sexy enough to the funders to keep you going on that trajectory. And I think that there's certainly trade-offs, and yeah, it depends on the species a lot.
Yeah, from my perspective, it's interesting. I was interested in working, as I said, with the degu because it was a plural breeder. But during my PhD, I remember having conversations, a committee member asking me, who do you want to be like? And I remember saying Tim Glenbrock, because he was even at that time, he was pushing the envelope so much in different areas. And it started to make me think about long-term studies. And so I stuck with the Daegu as a model organism so that I could have a long-term study. And I remember talking to Luis in the first year about, let's have our short-term goals and then let's think long-term if we can keep it funded. And that's opened up a whole different suite of questions we can ask. And then the other thing that having that really good knowledge of one organism as one way of doing things is it's allowed me to open up very different questions. Like Xavier's on the project because he brought a very different perspective to it. And I have funding flexibility through the program that funds the project to basically let me do what I want within an overarching framework. And so, I was able to bring in plant biologists to have them, Xavier, to work on a project that has a lot of potential to grow the kind of questions we ask later. And then later, as I was developing a research program, this brings it back to the central question. I got with Carsten to think about more broad the mammal story that we're working on. And I'll just say one of the things that really happened in my career that I don't know if it was brought up so much was luck. I got lucky. That NSF program that funds the Chile work started when I was in my final year of my PhD or very close to the end. So when I didn't have a postdoc, so when I got my first job, I got an NSF grant the first year because there were only 25 applicants. Now there are over 150, I'm guessing, at the IRES program. It gets really, really challenging. So luck plays a big role into it, but you also have to play your hand into the luck too. Through my work with Nancy, I learned a lot about NSF, and I can't say enough to agree with Clara's comment that Nancy had a big impact, not just in the research, but in her training. So that's something we, working with your advisors to really learn to navigate whatever system you're in. I was NSF, but David, you're dealing with England. Adriana's dealing with Colombia and the European Union. So a bit of ramble, but I think it kind of hits on some of the other points. Adriana, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's a question very close to what David's kind of question, and so we all aim for a research program, even though, like, at least here in Colombia, we don't think about it in such structural way. And I think the reason is, since you have to sort of supervise this amount of students at the undergrad level, somehow you need to fit them into your program. And I think my question is, how much flexibility can you actually give yourself to sort of cover topics that are not within that umbrella of your research program, right? So sometimes I feel like, you've been stretched out into like, oh yes, because I know behavior, then it's like you can study this and that one, or you're expected to more than have to, but you're expected to sort of, go and go into different areas that you're not actually expert on. So yeah, that's my question. Different systems, different questions. Not even just like if I were to have just one system, I would have probably questions on different areas that I'm not expert on, or being asked to move into systems that I'm not expert, even if it's within my sort of topic. Yeah.
I can speak to that a little, I think, if that's right.
Go ahead, David, please.
Yeah, I've got a PhD student currently working on rice, and I'm a lead supervisor, which is mental, to be honest. But it's about collaborators. I wouldn't go anywhere near any plant if I wasn't working with someone who knows all about that plant, to be perfectly honest. What I can do is I can say, I'm absolutely bringing the perspective on social interactions and indirect genetic effects to the rice. So it's like, if I'm going to be that far outside my comfort zone on the organism, A, I need a collaborator, and B, the concepts need to be totally in my wheelhouse. So I'm like very, very useful. Because if I'm like, oh, it's like kind of behavioral in a plant, I'm like, oh, I'm maybe not the person for it. But yeah, so if you're going to totally change study organism, the concept needs to be like what you really know about. So you don't, you're not like wasting energy trying to learn two things. And then yeah, collaborators who do know about that other animal. As they're essential. Otherwise, you're gonna like, because occasionally we have meet with a student ask me questions about rice. I'm like, sorry, like I don't know what the development time is, unfortunately, and we can find out, but it just slows everything down. So, but yeah, we work out a system. So
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think some of that flexibility is especially important, like maybe not so much once you're established, but when you're developing a research program, like I had to think about questions that are interesting to me that like I'm applying to jobs kind of all over. I was applying to jobs in Europe, in Canada, in the US, and like trying to frame questions for my research program that I could sell anywhere. Is like, this is a question I could address here. And then coming in and learning a whole new system and trying to figure out how to mold those questions and those systems together. And I think, you know, as you go down in the system and you start to ask those questions, we all knew nothing about behavioral ecology at some point, right? And we learned it. So it really depends, I think, how interesting it is to you and how much you're willing to dive into that. And that trade-off with then like having other people and then having good collaborators to make sure you don't like look a fool when you start exploring new and exciting areas of research.
And I think to follow up on David's point about collaborators, you know, I'm looking at Adriana because the social network analyses that I'm interested in, Adriana has been working with us and that brought a level of expertise. I think one important thing for the students to know is that you got to stick your neck out there a little bit and not be afraid to sound like an idiot. You know, I've written so many people in my career and said, hey, I'm interested in this, and are you interested in this? And it turned into things like, you know, I had a neuroanatomist who worked with me, a famous neuroanatomist who worked with me on a project with voles in Taiwan. And it was a 2-year project. And it was because I reached out to him and said, this is what I'm interested in. Are you interested? And so, you know, if you've got, then that comes to one of the other things that I think is really important to developing research programs, creativity. Being able to be creative and recognize those important collaborators who will help you achieve that creativity, I think is essential, critical. Anyone else? So we're almost out of time. So I just wanted to give the students one last chance to have a voice. What is your take from this? If you could summarize what you've learned, hopefully you're even reinforced if you've already learned this. What would you say? What would you say to the older people in the crowd who are like, yeah, we've been through this. But we want to learn from you too.
This has been really great, really interesting, especially the international perspectives and learning about how just everything differs everywhere you go in academia. I'd love to ask, so I'm approaching the end of my PhD and I'm looking to transition into, you know, a postdoc potentially, and I'd love to hear everyone who's done a postdoc what their advice would be if they could go back in time.
I'll pass only because I didn't do one.
I'm not sure what you're asking, Xavier, about.
I guess like hidden curriculum aspects of that, where just like what was the transition like from PhD to postdoc, and then what advice would you give your younger self when you made that transition?
I did 2 postdocs, and they were both awesome. What I will say personally, I think postdocing is peak of your career. Like it doesn't get better than postdocing. So just remember that during the postdoc, because you've now developed the skills to do research and do it fairly well. You like are more confident because you've finished a PhD, but you don't yet have the overwhelming life responsibilities of being a PI and like stressing about financials and spending way more time worrying about how you're going to pay your employees than you ever did, or like having a bajillion meetings. I have never felt busier in my life. Although to be fair, I realized my first semester of faculty where I was like, oh my God, I'm not cut out for this. This is so overwhelming. I had Lyme disease and long COVID. And so I was like forgetting, I was like 15 minutes late to a few meetings and I was like, this is it. My world is ending. And I just needed some medication. But some doxycycline for the Lyme disease, especially. No, I one enjoy postdocing because it's like that sweet spot in your career of like least amount of responsibilities for most amount of like skill balance. I didn't find that there was a ton of stuff about postdocing itself that was challenging besides that transition to like, oh, you are now like a more like hourly employee potentially. Like my postdocs have to log and time cards and being really diligent about your time. Like thinking and protecting your time in a different way than maybe as a PhD student, you kind of live it. And at the end of the PhD, a lot of people come out really burnt out because you're just chugging the whole time. And that is not like sustainable long term. And so coming into the postdoc and being like, okay, I have time to do this. I have fewer responsibilities than I did. And I'm going to kind of be diligent in tracking my time. I think was something I wish that I had. I took a 7-month break after my PhD because I was really burnt out. And then in searching for a postdoc, really considering, and I get it's more challenging now because postdocs are harder to come by. I was very fortunate that I was in a postdocs market when I was a postdoc, but I turned down several postdocs because I got huge red flags from the PIs. Listen to your gut. Like I had somebody be like, I expect you to publish 14 papers your first year because we have a bunch of white papers you should be able to turn into publications. Or like I went on an interview where they were saying racist things in Texas. And I was like, oh, I can't live here. So like, I mean, those are pretty overt red flags, but like listen to your gut. Trust the red flags. If you are feeling like this isn't it, there will be another offer. Don't take something just because it's offered. And that was a hard lesson to learn. I like sobbed the 2-hour drive back from El Paso, like, I'm gonna have to turn this postdoc down, and what if I never get another offer? But I was like, do I want to put myself in this scenario and live in this place? And that answered the question. So hopefully that's helpful.
It is, thank you.
When I was looking for postdoc, so I was finishing my PhD, high stress levels, very busy and stuff, and trying to look for a postdoc. What I found is that just weren't many people with the monies to hire a postdoc. So it's not like there were a lot of choices around. I did reach out to people, and there were people who were interested, and we talked about things like writing a grant. But at that point, I couldn't write a grant with somebody and finish my PhD. I'm pretty sure that I could not have straddled that fence. I lucked out and got a postdoc that suited me really well. I don't know what I would have done differently. It's hard to say. I knew I had money for a year, maybe for 2 years. And I was already starting to think about a second postdoc because jobs were very tight. So I drove like 2 hours to go to somebody's seminar to meet somebody because I was really considering him for a second postdoc in case we didn't get money for me to continue what I was doing there. But and what Kathleen was just saying, it is a great time, but after some time, I was only there 13 months. After some time, I was starting to think like, oh, I'm going to have to get a job. I could do this for a while, but I need a job. And that was a little stressful. I'll stop there because Kathleen might have some more to add that's more recent.
Yeah,
I just thought
Kathleen,
I just thought of a couple more things that I want to say. Don't be afraid to ask. Like, apply for positions that sound interesting. And like ask, like, can this position be remote if you want to be remote from somewhere? Like I hired a postdoc recently and she is a top candidate, and then she's like, I'd like to be remote. And we were like, sure, you just have to come stay here for a month. We'll give you housing to get to know everyone, build community. And then she went back to her husband and house that she owns in Wisconsin. And also don't be afraid to ask, like, if you have a good supervisor, which, hopefully you're doing that due diligence to check them out. Like, ask them for feedback on job applications, ask them for help. Like my postdoc supervisors, they read all of my materials, they helped me apply for jobs, have the conversation about like what you want to get out of the postdoc, because it's a growth experience for you. And like as somebody who's had a postdoc leave the lab and has a postdoc currently, like my number one goal for them is that I recognize that this is temporary and that they get a job that they want. And so we have meetings every single semester about like, what can we do to make this postdoc as beneficial to your career as possible, while also making sure you're making research progress. So it's really about like that kind of communication as two people with PhDs that are equivalents, basically. Like, yeah, I'm their supervisor, I sign their time cards, but like they have the same degree as me.
I think we're just about at the end, but I might add one more thing to Xavier's question. Even though I didn't do a postdoc, I've had a postdoc in Chile, and you may already know this, but look into other countries if you're interested in that. There are funding programs specific for postdoc. Like Chile has a postdoc program that's pretty decent, and it supported Ana Marie for 2 years. They're just, I guess you got to do your homework and look around. And then the one thing, when I was looking for postdocs, I did look for postdocs. When I did, particularly with Luis, I was thinking longer term too. And Luis worked with me to help me let that evolve into the Degu project. So when you're thinking about postdocs, there may be short-term goals, but then you might also have longer-term goals that facilitate collaborations with people who are already established and can help you grow in your career and your program. So, all right, so it's 1 o'clock. So I want to thank you all so very much for this. This has been a pleasure for me in so many ways, because I learned a lot. Hopefully you guys learned a lot. Hopefully the Find community did, but also because I basically have my academic family sitting there in front of me, and it's fun to see where everyone's at and working together to help learn from each other. And David, thank you for participating. I'm really looking forward to your talk next week. And yeah, thanks to the community. I'll